In the immediate aftermath of Pope Francis's publication of his Motu Proprio Traditionis Costodes, there's obviously been a lot of reaction. I've already done at least one video, if not two, depending on how you look at it, in reaction and in response to it. But there was something else that happened that I thought was quite strange, and I didn't hear about it until somewhat later because I went on vacation right after it was published. And so when I returned and went to Mass with my parish community, which is a traditional Latin Mass community, I heard these reports from people about what happened that immediate Sunday. So the document was published on a Friday, and then that Sunday, people showed up for Mass and discovered that there were people waiting for them outside. Now, these people were representing both Eastern Orthodox communities. I believe it was an actual priest, an Eastern Orthodox priest. I don't know if he was Russian Orthodox or Ukrainian or Greek Catholic, or not Catholic, but Greek Orthodox. But he was from, let's say, Orthodoxy. And the other was from, I think it was a group of people from the SSPX who were using this opportunity to perhaps capitalize on the disenfranchisement of traditional Catholics to say, hey, the grass is a little greener over here. Why don't you guys come join us now? And while I wasn't there, this was relayed to me secondhand. The people who were telling me about it relayed that their immediate reaction to this was mostly negative. They just felt like if I was there, I would have almost felt dirty that we were having this kind of a conversation. To me, this seems less like evangelism or a sincere invitation among people who you consider to be maybe your equals in some sense, as much as it seems more like scavenging people who are down on their luck or in a moment of tribulation, and you're trying to take advantage of them. And I don't want to imply that everybody from Eastern Orthodoxy would have this instinct, or necessarily from the SSPX either, but it is very interesting to me that in this moment, and this isn't the only incident I can point to a lot of, I would say, uptick in comments on my channel, even messages that I've got from people saying, hey, you should become Protestant now, or you should become Eastern Orthodox. The door is open. This is the moment you've been waiting for, and this is the revelation and the experience that should compel you in that direction. And the fact that this moment is chosen by them to really accelerate or ramp up their invitations or their proselytism or their evangelistic behavior, I think is quite revealing of a few things, and I'll try to highlight those as we go on. But before I do so, I think it's worth revisiting why a person would be Catholic to begin with. And this, for me, would be tracing my own conversion experience to some degree and some of the conclusions and the premises that I had to adopt to get there. And then why a person might attend a traditional Catholic community. And I'm just going to use that word. I mean, there's a lot of ways to describe what I mean by traditional community, but I think everybody knows what I mean by that. So I'm just going to use traditional. Okay, so what are these premises and conclusions that I had to adopt to get to where I am now as a believing Catholic? Well, the first thing was, and I've said this in the past, so forgive me for being redundant here, but I think this is a good point to revisit it. The first thing is I accepted that God existed. The second, that Jesus Christ is divinity incarnate. He is the Son of God. The third premise or conclusion is that Jesus established a church. And not just sort of some vague understanding of a church, but a church with criteria that are attached to it. It has to be apostolic. It has to be established by him. It has to be one. It has to be holy. And it has to be sacramental too. It has to have this sort of sacramental spirituality associated with it. That was an adoption, or that was a conclusion that I came to later on. But now that I've been living within that sacramental spirituality, it's become indispensable to me. Now, I'm not Catholic because it happens to appeal to me the most. In fact, when I first started surveying the landscape of let's say, churches, Catholicism was way down my list of what I would have considered appealing to me based on my sensibilities at the time. But let's say Catholicism is appealing to you, or maybe Orthodoxy is appealing to you, or Protestantism is appealing to your sensibilities and your tastes and your preferences. That is the wrong reason to invest yourself in any of these communities or to submit to them as some vision of the church. The right reason is because it's true. And that sequence of adopting certain conclusions is, for me, the accumulation of the bigger conclusion, which is just that it's true. So with that in mind, I appreciate this instinct to go and to reach out to traditional Catholics in a moment in history like this and say, hey, you should come check out what it is that we have, because you obviously like certain things within your spirituality and your piety, and maybe you even consider those to be essential to your theology. So we have a lot of those things over here. If you just came and checked it out, you might stick around. You might like it. We noticed that you liked things like chant. You like sort of an ancient form of the liturgy. You like beauty and its expression in that piety. You like traditional forms of architecture. You like traditional vestments. All of these things, we have these things. So again, come on over. I get that, the instinct to sort of to connect those dots. But the reason I'm Catholic is, yes, those things exist within the Catholic Church, and I've come to grow attached to those things and to find that they really encourage me and strengthen me in my piety and my devotion to God, and help me encounter God, who is beauty itself. But that isn't the reason that I'm Catholic. Those things aren't all necessary for my adherence to Catholicism. And I would even say that, at least in the sense of an Orthodox person talking to a traditional Catholic like myself about that, I would say that it conveys maybe a confusion about what is meant by tradition, and why myself as a Catholic why to be Catholic is to be grounded in tradition, and why that's absolutely essential to be a follower of Jesus. Tradition is part of what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. So what do I mean by tradition in this sense? Tradition doesn't mean something that comes from long ago necessarily. It doesn't mean something that's old, like older forms of music or older forms of architecture. Although those things can be tradition or traditional, that's not necessarily what it means. And I often get the sense from Orthodox people that they mistake the fact that their liturgical expressions and their piety and their theology, because it's old, it is therefore traditional. And since we identify us traditional Catholics as being traditional, then that must also appeal for us. And so that if we can't have what we want over here, then we'll go find old stuff over here. What tradition actually means is to be handed on. So what this means is that, obviously, in the case of Christianity, there is a covenant, there is a deposit of faith, there are certain things that we have to adopt and know. There is a knowledge that comes to us from divinity, from God, through his Son and through the Holy Spirit, and then transmitted and filled up into the church. And then with each successive generation, that knowledge, that faith, is transmitted on. It is both transmitted by successive generations through structures perhaps that they've created, like educational institutions, catechetical formulas or curricula, writings, theology, and then it is accepted by those successive generations who appreciate the need for tradition by virtue of the fact that they adopted this faith that comes from not their immediate experience. Like, Jesus wasn't incarnate today. He is incarnate today, but that didn't happen in space and time today. It didn't start today. It happened 2,000 years ago. And so we who adopt this faith, we recognize that is coming down to us through successive generations through something known as tradition. Tradition is something that is handed on, and because it shares this dynamic of coming from a previous generation to successive generations, and most immediately in sort of like the family experience and elders within the church, it's a dynamic living thing. It's an exchange that takes place. It's not merely something that is old. And the analogy that comes to mind for me among mistaken notions of tradition would be something more like a statue that was carved out of antiquity, and we're just preserving it and honoring it. But it's not really something that we understand. It's not sort of a living thing that carries on. true tradition would be more like, and this was how I would describe the tradition of the true church, is like a building that is started on the firm foundation of the rock of St. Peter. And that's why Jesus, I think, often talked about, building your house on a firm foundation. The true church is built on the rock of St. Peter, and then it is sort of built up through the centuries and perhaps ornamented through certain things, or maybe something like a garden that is tended and pruned from time to time and cared for. You don't reinvent the garden with every generation. You don't reinvent the building. You don't make it your own, but you can elaborate upon the thing that exists. And in Catholic theology, this is known as the development of doctrine. Development of doctrine doesn't mean it just changes constantly into something different from what it was before. It's always going to be this building, this essential building that is built on this firm foundation. And again, you might ornament it, you might elaborate on certain elements of it. You might look at a column and say, let's add something to that column and let's make it a little bit more beautiful, or let's elaborate on it. But there will always be a column there. There's always this essential need for this column, right? So tradition is a dynamic, living thing. It's not this dead statue or graveyard, which just happens to be old, and therefore we value it because it's old. It's something that has stood through the test of time as it exchanges hands, as it is handed on from generation to generation and accepted by each generation and applied to their circumstance and the unique challenges that they might face within their lives. Now, I'm a traditional Catholic, that is to say, someone who attends and invests myself in a more traditional community, because I believe that for the sake of my family and for myself, that is where we have best found that we are grounded in that authentic Catholic tradition, where the transmission that takes place is more authentic. In other parish communities that we've been a part of in the past, it's been something more like a syncretism and sort of a big blind spot for everything that has come from us through that great deposit of faith, that rich history and heritage of the church. There's a big blind spot there, and more of a syncretism for what exists today and what is novel today, and trying to combine that with Catholic teachings, often in a very clumsy and unsuccessful way. And after attending and investing in a community like that for a long time, we decided that, this just isn't really giving us that rich experience of what it means to be part of the tradition of Catholicism. And so that's why we find ourselves in a traditional Catholic community. Now, yes, there are moments in the church, and we're experiencing one of those, where tradition might get marginalized, or especially the expressions of tradition might get marginalized, even by the authorities in the church. And so now we have lots of Protestants and groups like the Eastern Orthodox and even the SSPX, which I'm not really going to get into in this video, but groups like that seeing this as an opportunity and inviting us out. And I just think it's a massive leap of logic to say, well, because you can't now obtain that best expression of Catholicism and that best transmission of Catholicism, you might as well just abandon Catholicism altogether. That to me is, that doesn't follow. It would be sort of like if you had a job, right? A lot of us are familiar with the experience of having a job. So you have a job and you recognize the value of having that job for what it provides for you, a sense of vocation, but especially an income and the ability to provide for yourself and hopefully your family if you have a family. Let's say at this particular job, your boss disciplined you in an unfair way or an unjust way, or was just maybe not a great boss. Or they had to cut back your salary because of restructuring or an economic downturn or something like that. Would it be a legitimate response to say, well, to heck with jobs, to heck with my career, I don't want anything to do with this. I'm going to go and just play video games in my basement for the rest of my life. Obviously, that doesn't follow. You still recognize the value of your job, even if it's somewhat difficult to stay grounded within that job because of adversity and challenges that exist there. Something like that is true for the church, because the church is always going to have the human element within it, which is going to make it not always easy to abide by and to submit to. Another example might be the family. And I've used this analogy a lot in the past, that the church is something like a family. So imagine if, you see your friends' families and you see things that they do with their parents, and maybe you're kind of jealous of that. And maybe you think, well, oh, their dad plays hockey and I really like hockey and I wish my dad played hockey. Or imagine if your particular dad was also really strict with you, or maybe he disciplined you in a way that was sometimes even unfair. Would you look at that and then say, well, to heck with families, I'm going to go enroll myself in the foster care system? That's a much better improvement. Now, I understand that an orthodox response to that might be, but we're a better family, or we're a better job, or a better career. So that's why it would make sense to leave your current job and come over to the one that's being offered now. Well, I've already discussed a little bit about why a person would adopt Catholicism, and I've done videos in the past about Orthodoxy, about why I don't think Eastern Orthodoxy is true, or that it has the fullness of the truth. There's a lot that is true in Eastern Orthodoxy, and if there were no alternatives, I would probably find quite a bit of consolation there, and quite a bit of nurturing of my faith there. But it's not the fullness of the truth. I believe the fullness of the truth is found in the Catholic Church, and I described a little bit about a sequence of how I arrived at that. But I think that there are other indications in this particular scenario that we find ourselves in, and the fact that we are finding invitations to join Orthodoxy, that are a bit of an indication that reinforces my conclusion about this. And so I'll explain a little bit more why that is. One thing I would say is that it's revealing to me that I've never seen such aggressive invitation appear in the past, when perhaps traditional Catholics felt more confident that their communities would be preserved and encouraged within the Catholic Church. An analogy for me is like, so let's revisit the career analogy, right? Imagine you have a company that you are an employee of, and that there are other rival companies that are out there. So your company at certain points in time is just really accelerating, doing well. It's very prosperous. It's making a lot of money. It's hiring a lot of people, and those people are very satisfied within their jobs, and they get a lot of encouragement from management, and things are just very prosperous. But then things start to go down for whatever reason. Maybe there's an economic downturn, or there's a market shift, and things are becoming a little more difficult, as well as with management. So your relationship with your employers and your supervisors and your bosses is becoming somewhat strained through that as well. Now, in the time of prosperity, you never hear from rival organizations with job offers. You might in a casual scenario, right? Like if you cross paths on the street and you see a guy who does the same thing, and you happen to know him through the industry, and he says, hey, you should come work for us sometime. But it's not an actual job offer, right? It's just always sort of a casual invitation. But now all of a sudden that things are bad for you, they come with actual job offers at that point. What would that communicate to you? One thing it would communicate to me is that they never likely felt that their invitation was strong enough when you were in a position of strength and prosperity. So they just didn't really bother. But now that they see that you're in a position of weakness or adversity, now the aggressive job offers start to roll in. And that would, to me, would speak of the weakness of their position, that they couldn't try to meet you or face you from your position of strength, only your position of weakness. I think it says something about the fact that they probably thought that you wouldn't find their job offer attractive unless you were in a position of adversity and weakness. And now that you are, again, they're really more aggressively pursuing you as a potential employer on their side, or an employee on their side. That to me seems like something of a concession, again, of the weakness of their position. I think there's also something that is revealing about the specific nature of now. What happened right now? Well, the Pope did something that traditional Catholics feel is unjust, or potentially feel marginalized by, or even attacked by. And the fact that this is an interaction with the Pope, not maybe like some theology or something else institutional, but specifically with the Pope, that Protestants and Eastern Orthodox would see as an opportunity to capitalize on. To me, that suggests that they see something of their own identity there. They see that we would identify with them now because their identity is very much encapsulated in this fact of rebellion against the Pope and against the Papacy, which says something about who they are. It's not that they are asserting their own identity in something that is uniquely their own, but rather it's derivative of something else. I would say this is especially true for Protestants, but somewhat true for the Orthodox as well, in that they are, in the case of Protestants, they are protesting against something else that exists, which makes them derivative. Their identity relies upon the existence of something else that they are protesting against. And I would say that there are shades of that within Orthodoxy as well. Lastly, maybe I'll just end on a note of thought about Orthodoxy itself. As I said, I've done other videos in the past about why I'm not Eastern Orthodox, and feel free to check those out. But one thing I didn't bring up in that video, which is something I've been reflecting on more and more recently, is the nature of the church and the covenant of the church. And how it is sort of a fulfillment of the trajectory of salvation history. So let me try and unwrap this a little bit. So if you look at the progression that exists within salvation history, which is depicted in Scripture for us, going back through the Old Testament, there is a direction and a trajectory. So let's go back to, obviously, the fall. We had this huge rupture between us and God, where it got to the point where God was completely and utterly familiar to successive generations of humanity. And whereas the Bible describes humanity had grown extremely evil and rebellious, and not just rebellious against God, but also themselves and their own nature and each other. And so God, in his divine providence and in his plan for humanity, he started to realize a rescue mission. And that rescue mission unfolded in a particular way. And it starts with his relationship and his reintroduction to humanity with a person and a family. So that would be like the covenant with Noah. Okay, so it's quite small. It's a small group that will then grow and expand, and that's how salvation history sort of grows. It's sort of like the mustard seed parable. It's something that starts small and grows into something that is very big, but it grows slowly and subtly. Okay. So the next sequence in salvation history you could point to might be Abraham. And so now this new covenant is established in this relationship between God and humanity through the person of Abraham and his offspring and his descendants. Now it goes from being a family to something like a tribe. It's grown in scope, right? And then the next progression in this sequence would be like Moses and the Israelites. So it goes from a tribe to a nation, right? And then the Israelites carry on with that covenant and they are shaped by it, and they grow from it, and they learn from it, and there's ups and downs until eventually Jesus of Nazareth appears, God incarnate, and he establishes a new covenant with his blood, with the sacrifice of his body, blood, soul, and divinity. And that becomes a covenant not just for a nation, but for all nations. Again, the scope is expanded. It becomes universal. That's the nature of the church. That's what the church preserves, is a universal covenant for all people. Now with Orthodoxy, Eastern Orthodoxy, there isn't an Orthodox church. There are Orthodox churches who share a theology, yes, share certain practices and certain forms of piety, but they aren't in communion in a real incarnational way, in a universal way. So these Orthodox churches are, they're defined by temporal realities, which is national boundaries and borders. And then they're sort of all divided by that. But they can't breach those borders into a sort of a universal expression of the faith without something like an ecumenical council. And as long as they have been Eastern Orthodoxy since the Great Schism, there have been no ecumenical councils within the East. There have been in the West, but not the East. They don't have the ability to call ecumenical councils anymore because there's no universal expression of their faith as a single church. They are churches. And the other problem with this idea of establishing churches based on a temporal reality. Well, temporal realities, like national boundaries, they shift, they change over time. Countries rise, and nations fall. Nations are conquered. So look at some of the original apostolic sees, like Alexandria. It doesn't exist anymore. Antioch, it doesn't exist anymore. Even Constantinople doesn't really exist anymore. Now, you could say the same thing about Rome, but Rome isn't based on the temporal reality of the Roman Empire. It's based on the fact that that's where Peter was martyred, Saint Peter, the rock of the church that Jesus had established. And so the Catholic identity is grounded on Peter more so than the fact of Roman imperial boundaries or a Roman city-state or something like that. So the same criticism can't really be leveled at Catholicism. So to summarize, the Catholic Church better reflects this notion of a universal covenant with all nations. And a good example of this, a good sort of practical example of this, is when the New World was discovered. So how do you go and evangelize these new people, these new lands? Well, if you are a universal church, you just send out missionaries. And the Pope, who is the successor of St. Peter, can do that. But if you're the Patriarch of Moscow, who understands an ecclesiology based on this idea that I can't breach my own borders, I only have authority within my particular ecclesial boundaries, being in this case Russia, well, how do I then go and send out missionaries? Well, you can't unless you contradict yourself. You say that the church is based on this idea of apostolic sees, all who have their own autonomy, they're autocephalous. And Moscow can't tell Constantinople what to do, or Alexandria what to do, or Jerusalem what to do, or Rome what to do for that matter. That's what they said to Rome. You don't have an authority that breaches your own particular boundaries. Well, if that's true, then how do you breach your own boundaries without contradicting yourself for the sake of evangelization? If the church is really just a sort of an alliance of churches based on temporal national boundaries, then how do you, without an ecumenical council, decide how to go and evangelize new lands? Well, you can't. And the only reason that Russian Orthodox churches or Greek Orthodox churches exist in a place like Canada where I live is because Greeks and Russians came here and needed pastoral care. And so they sent pastors to care for them. But there's never really been a universal evangelistic effort that breaches those borders because they can't. And even when they've tried to, they only do so out of a self-contradiction. So that's why I don't think, first of all, orthodoxy is true. I don't believe that it reflects this progression of salvation history going from a family to a tribe to a nation to all nations. It's more like a contraction back to just nations who are all on their own. They're all islands in a sea almost. Whereas Catholicism is truly universal, which is what a particular interpretation of the word Catholic means. It means universal. So obviously I still believe Catholicism is true, even though we're experiencing adversity as Catholics and especially as traditional Catholics. But just because, again, I can't access what I believe to be the best mode of transmission of traditional Catholicism, of the tradition of Catholicism, doesn't mean I would abandon Catholicism altogether. Hey, thanks for watching that. If you enjoyed it, then be sure to like and subscribe for more. And if you want to support the making of content like this, then please consider joining my online community, The Reinforcements. It's kind of like Patreon, but instead of being beholden to a big tech company, it's a website I built entirely myself, so there's no risk of us being censored or shut down or anything like that. There are hundreds of people who have already signed up, and our mission is to renew and reinforce the church. So if that's you, then come check it out. As an added bonus for certain tiers, I will also send you a gift box from Glory and Shine, which is a Catholic, family-owned and operated company. They make bath and body products. They're their beard balm I'm supporting, or I'm sporting right now. I'm not just a spokesperson, I'm actually a customer. So even if you don't join the Reinforcements, maybe check them out anyways. Glory and Shine, they're an amazing company.